Do you want to know what the fallen are, little one? In a sense, they are angels, but not the angels your mom imagines she prays to. Brass trumpets picnicking in the clouds. In their true essence, they are great swirling engines of wing and blood, fiery eyes that peer around the corners between worlds. Dark, radiant things conjured from fresh battlefields. A Frankenstein's Valkyrie, forever crashing to Midgard. What grief demands their hate? What vast cannibal hunger?
Welcome to the Fallen Cycle. This is a universe full of secrets, waiting for those brave or foolhardy enough to seek them out. Tales from When I Had a Face was written by James Curcio, with editing by Brian Johnson. A modern fairy tale about death, loss, and finding redemption in the strangest places, for those of us still haunted by the uncertain, occult logic of dreams. The soundtrack features the work of David Bessel, along with contributions from Jen E., P. Emerson Williams, and James Curcio, from the archives of past Mythos projects. Support for this project is pivotal. By becoming a patron at patreon.com/mythosmedia, that's MYTHOS media, you enable us to make more content like this, and to be able to hire on more freelance artists in future works. You can also discover more about the Mythpunk Fallen Cycle universe at fallencycle.com. This podcast contains adult themes and may induce psychosis. And now, this week's episode. Season 1, Episode 8, The City of Stars.
I was awakened by a cry from above. Still rubbing my eyes, I stumbled above deck into the daylight, afraid of what I might find, but I was greeted by a scene straight out of a picture book fairy tale. Before us stretched the Nadia, a lake dotted here and there by sailboats making their lazy way across water as smooth and clear as a mirror. The city beyond was built in the shade of many plateaus that ringed the far side of the lake and sheltered it to the west. The minaret of the central palace was first to pierce the fog, like a lone white horn thrust high into the sky. Then the shadows of the library appeared, and then the matching parapets of the academies and marketplace. In place of streets, cultivated gardens grew between Ashenti's bathhouses, which crouched like vagrants at the foot of the resplendent mountains, hot steam rising from their many blue-tiled pools to join the clouds above. We found our mooring in the docks and disembarked with a renewed sense of calm. Elena covered her eyes as we walked past one of the outdoor bathing pools. She peeked between her fingers and then dropped her hands altogether. A small smile played across her features as she peered within, like a momentary ripple of sun on the water. But Samah gently grasped her by the hand and led her away. "We have a purpose here," Samah said, apparently for her benefit. Then he grinned. "But feel free to look, heaven knows I couldn't stop you." We walked and the others talked for a time, but then I recalled turning to his servant and asking, "Wallaj, how did you come to work for Samah?" He stopped and leaned on his spear, his face typically grim. Unsurprisingly, he did not partake of the rolled mavosh that Samah and I were passing back and forth. "My father came to an agreement with the Walhallan family," Wallaj said simply. Then he shrugged and continued walking. "Other Mibari came to look upon us with suspicion and with longing, envy, serving the royal family. Of course they were envious. We moved overnight from reed huts to the palace where every need and desire is satisfied." Elena smiled at him. "No wise master mistreats a servant." "Is that what they teach you in the north? You are braver than you know, child, to say such things, but you know nothing of our world." "I am proud to give service to House Walhallan," he said, bowing toward the palace almost habitually. "I am not his servant. I am his abdal, his guardian, I guess you might say, and he is my patron." We walked down a path paved with smooth stone. Tropical plants grew from pots that lined these crisscrossing paths, and people passed to and fro between them or lounged in their shade. A woman spotted us from beneath a date tree and moved in our direction. She seemed to float beneath her veils, as if she swam through the air. The blue fabric was mostly transparent in shadow and shimmered in the light, rendering a curious effect whereby she seemed at once entirely naked and wrapped in a scintillating opacity. Jewelry tinkled as she approached, striding with casual confidence. "Nadia Ishara," Samah said, bowing deeply. "Abishai Samah," she replied with her arms raised high. They smiled at one another, and I realized their seriousness was in jest. I would later discover from Eluane that the mothers and daughters of Imari royalty were also named after the lake. Nadia, clothed in raiment the blue of her waters, and their sons and fathers were named after the air. Abishai. Then the smile melted from Ishara's face. "I'd started to believe you no longer lived with us. Our father asks for you," she said. "Good, since we are here to see him," Samah said. She opened her mouth to respond, but then she noticed Wallaj and ran to him, wrapping her arms around his broad back. At first he stood stiffly, as if uncertain what to do, but then he melted as he held her close, and his spear clattered to the ground. She was proportioned to him almost like a child, but it was his demeanor that became childlike. His face shone, and his smile reflected in his eyes. "I've missed you," I could hear her murmur. He said nothing at all, but his feelings were clear as they continued to embrace. Samah crossed his arms, but Eluane was scanning the others who walked by. "Wallaj," Eluane said, "is it usual for so many of your people to be here so armed?" Wallaj looked over his shoulder and saw many Mibari hovering uncertainly in place. They all carried spears, as he did. "Every Mibari is given their spear after their first successful hunt," he said, shrugging. But Samah was also concerned by the expressions on their faces, although, as Wallaj had indicated, the weapons weren't unusual. Soothe a paranoid mind. Wallaj stepped back from Ishara and looked skyward with some anxiety himself, as if he could still see the comet in the daytime sky. He picked up his own spear. Then he bowed to Samah without making eye contact and walked down the street. Ishara's gaze followed him from behind her veil. I was hardly paying attention to their little drama. I wondered to myself how they had escaped the grotesquerie and madness that so often besets royalty. Many nights later, Eluane told me in hushed tones that it was not uncommon for the royal Nadia to be secretly adopted from the streets of Babylon, and many orphans wandering those labyrinths prayed that they might be so chosen. The more likely outcomes were far less pleasant. This was not unlike how the sisters were chosen in Babylon. They were selected supposedly by the inscrutable providence of the hidden powers themselves, but in reality, I imagined it was the work of the priests. How different were the faiths of Nadia and Babylon after all? Their patron saints were not the same. Perhaps the Imari held no such eschatological expectation, believing their goddess was already materially manifest about them. I do not know. "You're too familiar," Samah said to his sister as I continued to half wander in my thoughts. Ishara scowled and turned to leave. "You know how familiar we are. Why would I pretend otherwise?" Eluane raised his hands in ceremonial greeting and called after her. "Tell your father, Al-Wahalan, head Abishai of all Imari and king of Ashenti, that I have returned." She raised an eyebrow at his formality, but then bowed to him. "As I said, he'll be wanting to see you." And she disappeared into the crowd. I should go with her to the palace. "Take the girls to the gardens," Samah said to Eluane when his sister had gone. "We'll send for you when father is ready to play king." The four of us wandered a manicured path through one of the central gardens beside the palace. Streams, statuary, and wisps of steam broke the stately lines of the walkways. I am told that when seen from the air, the garden paths are like the petals of a rose, all winding toward an enclosed center. In this way, too, Ashenti was both like and unlike its rival. Where the maze of the outer city of New Babylon seemed endless, and without any apparent forethought, Ashenti maintained a subtle consistency, a sort of mindfulness that becomes almost invisible. but remains ever present. Everything had been considered, everything had a place. All was shaded from the sun by the swaying leaves of tropical plants or awnings that stretched over baths and pavilions of stained glass, but otherwise stood unguarded. No wall stretched around this city. I felt as if I had all the time in the world to enjoy the sun overhead, the sloshing of water at my back, the fragrant air. For that moment, I felt safe. Where there were doors at all, there were no locks. The Amari believed themselves of one family, and amongst them I felt an immediate pang for something that I never knew I'd lacked. I also knew at once that, as friendly as they might appear, I would never get to stand inside that circle. I could only ever look in from the outside and imagine how nice it might have been if I had been born to different parents in this different time. Without knowing it, I think they cultivated jealousy in everyone they graced with their hospitality, but not Nisa. Here, in the presence of gently growing things, she was a repository of pure joy. She ran from flower to flower, shrieking with glee. Before we could stop her, she shoved a bright purple one in her mouth and started chewing, still beaming. Elena grabbed her hand. "You can't just eat any flower, Nisa. It isn't safe. You have to know—" Petals stuck out of Nisa's mouth like the legs of a broken insect. She shrugged and pushed them in with a finger and chewed the final stragglers as well. "Never mind," Elena said, seeing it was pointless. Nisa dropped to the ground and rolled back and forth. "You're like a little puppy," Elena exclaimed. She started untying the sash that belted her waist. Nisa stopped rolling and looked at her curiously. Elena tied the sash loosely around Nisa's neck. She began leading Nisa around the garden like she was a terrier. Eloane gave a helpless shrug and took a seat beside me on an ornate bench. The garden seemed to work some intoxication on Nisa, but I could see no immediate harm in it. He seemed content to gaze at the leaves and petals of obscene plants battering against one another in the breeze, but after several minutes of silence, I felt the need to speak. "We've been so caught up in madness, rushing from one place to the next, it has hardly sunk in how strange all this is to me," I said. "I've been counting sunrises. Did you know that today is my 21st birthday?" I continued when he remained silent, his bottomless eyes fixed on me, his head cocked slightly. "Is this of significance?" he asked. "Not really, except that it feels strange recognizing that time is passing." "It isn't," he said. "At least, not in the way you're used to." He packed his pipe, and then glanced to the younger girls, making sure they were still out of earshot, only to see Nisa and Elena splashing through a pool, giggling madly. The contrast struck me as funny, and I began to laugh as well. Then Elena climbed onto Nisa's back, kicking playfully with her heels, shouting, "Forward, pony!" "Can I ask you another question?" I probed, turning toward him. "Nothing has stopped you so far," he said with a wan smile. "Will you teach me to be Oyun?" I asked. He stared at me for an uncomfortable amount of time and shook his head. "No," he said, and he would not explain himself. I fell silent, swinging my feet beneath the bench idly, surprised at how disappointed I felt, although some part of me also knew it was destined to be. I heard the buzz of a hummingbird as it zipped past. "You speak of terror, but I look around. Everyone seems quite relaxed," I said. "It is a matter of appearances and disappearances. The disappearance of the star frightens those who know One Eye's prophecy and many others as well," he said. "And the appearance of a comet in its place. This is worse still." We sat for some time, gazing up at the outstretched arches capped with copper, silver, and bronze, like fingers reaching ever for the sky, and we heard laughter on the wind. "Samah and I talked last night, and I was meaning to ask you, what happened to your people? The Chittal—" I began, but was cut off as a Mibari messenger approached at that very moment. "Eluane, Al-Wahalan request your presence," she proclaimed loudly. The Raven Wanderer gave me an apologetic smile and rose to his feet. "The king awaits."
It is time, Gran thought. She reached into a chest beside her altar and took out a wooden mask. Following the procedure laid out in the chronicle, it had been carved, heat-treated, oiled and polished, but as of yet, unpainted. She placed it on the altar. With it, one day, her granddaughter might sneak past the Raven Wanderer himself and find her secret den. This day began not unlike any other, she said to her granddaughter. By its end, many would be dead, and what is worse, forgotten to all but the fine. Today, I give them the service of remembrance. She dipped a brush in ink, black ink that shone like a jewel in the light. I don't know their names or their number. She made a quick stab with the brush and painted around the eyes. I know the child that stared at me like a mute as I ran past, blinded to the light of reason because a pike had emptied the back of her head. She sighed. I know too much to know anything. Gran put down the brush and raised a hand to her temples. How did it happen? Eloane had led us from the gardens. He was following someone, a Mabari servant. The sun punctured the open spaces between the cliffs that hugged the city of stars. These fissures were uneven, curving in and out, walls of stone clearly fit for carving. How eager those artisans must have felt, graced with so much naked limestone and quartz in one place. She began gesturing with both hands, momentarily forgetting the brush in one of them. They worked their magic for generations. There were elaborate facades, flanked by spirals and arches and rare beasts, guarding entrances to the shelter of the natural caves that held the bath and pleasure houses. There were statues staring agelessly from alcoves, yet in the corner of my vision, I saw the men with painted faces, standing grimly by the roadsides, as if awaiting a sign. I saw the vultures overhead. Doom already hung over that place, just as it hangs over us now. I'm one of the last who can speak of what happened, but like the tunnels under Ashenti, this story was carved over hundreds of silent years. You must imagine them lapping away in the background until on this very day. At that moment, Gran slammed her fist on the table and the bones cracked like fireworks as they jolted about the metal bowl in reply. Candlelight danced in her eyes, thousands of tiny lights glowing like malignant will-o-wisps as she contemplated the contents in the bowl. She drew a blade and ran it quickly over her hand. Several drops of blood fell, mingled with ink, and she dipped the brush. 3 impertinent strokes. I merely saw the final footfall that started the rock slide that buried it all, she said, as she watched the ink dry. She raised the wood-handled brush like a conductor who was about to begin a grand symphony, and then, to young Ayta's surprise, dropped it in the metal bowl that glowed red with embers. Soon this dull glow sparked and turned yellow as the sharp smell of horsehair, blood, and sandalwood filled the air. Future generations might say with a shrug that their ghosts were paved over to build a new tomorrow. Such casual indifference to the bodies of mothers, and daughters, and sons. Common hands and common dreams build empires, they will say. What can you do? It has always been this way. Most of the dead vanish as if they'd never existed, but their spirits will chatter and paint new faces on faded masks. Some part of them is carried on, and they whisper in the dark, as I whisper to you today. For in all the ways that matter save one, I am already there, walking the fane. The fire died back down, and Gran herself seemed to shrink. She took a deep breath and waved her hand, the fingers trembling slightly as if in irritation at herself. Then she drew herself up tall and continued. They say it began small, as it always does, like that first hint of the turn of a season. You can sense it even before it happens. A chill runs through the sun. In an instant, summer has turned to autumn. It may grow warm again after that point, but it seems that even the sun can sense her own futility. Ayta stared down at the drying mask on the altar, a vague dread gnawing at her stomach.
We were taken to the gate of the royal palace, which was nestled in the center of the rosebud formed by Ashenti's many pathways. It was as if the palace were the central floret, and it was shaped accordingly. So it was said, from the center all flowed. To that center, everything would return. The inner chambers were vast, as if built for giants who no longer walked the earth. A double staircase split in opposite directions, and then rejoined at a circular outer chamber. I was told that beyond the double doors there the meeting would convene, and Elwain would, as he said, see what we may. I looked upward as we ascended. The ceiling was so far above us it felt like a vision amongst the clouds, painted with a scene of women crushing grapes under their bare feet. Beyond them were the most prominent stars of summer night, all white save the seventh like a red flame of Babylon, and the eighth, the deep blue star of Ashenti. That final star was painted at the apex of the arch that supported the entire building, though its counterpart no longer hung in the night sky. In its place now loomed a comet, invisible by light of day, but I could feel its presence tainting all our peace of mind. The messenger paused once we faced the barred doors that marked our destination, and pursed her lips in apparent discomfort before reiterating, "Your companions must wait out here," to Elwain, with a sweep of her arm toward the sofas that flanked the doors. He passed through without a glance at us, and the valves closed behind him with a thud, leaving us on the landing with nothing but the attention of the house servants. The light was beginning to fail. Many hours must have passed, although I had only a hazy recollection of them. We were sprawled out on the cushions, the wreckage of platter after platter of half-eaten fruits and sweets, and half-drunken teas strewn around us like fallen soldiers on a battlefield. A short bout of well-earned gluttony had distracted us from our unpleasant thoughts and feelings. Surely Elena had some. And Nissa, well, who knows what she felt really. The servants had brought this feast hours before, and were now nowhere to be seen. In fact, the entire palace seemed empty and permeated with uneasy silence. We simply could not eat another bite. At that moment of indecision and lethargy, we spotted Wallaj bounding up the stairs, but the look on his face immediately quelled our joy in seeing him. "Where is Elwain?" he demanded, breathing heavily. I pointed toward the door. "He's in—" Wallaj pushed past before I finished, heaving the door open with such impetus it slammed loudly against the wall. Inside was a long stone table. Around it sat Elwain, Samah, and many Imari dignitaries, and at its head was their king, an older man, heavy-set and hairy for an Imari, with a great beard and eyebrows that seemed to shift as constantly upon his face as tufts of cloud across the sky. Elwain had been drafting a letter when Wallaj stormed in, and he did not at once look up at the intruder. A breeze blew through an open arched door at the back of the room that led to a balcony beyond, and everyone paused. "Well, speak, Wallaj," Al-Wahalan bellowed. "You are welcome here, but stand there panting like an overworked horse. It is making me nervous." Wallaj leaned heavily on his spear. "Forgive me. Forgive us. The hungry star grips my people. Their eyes roll back, their hands clutch weapons, and they see only hate. This is not the way. This thing they do is wrong. So I come to you and ask that I may serve you one last time. Let me save your lives." Al-Wahalan shook his head. "I still do not understand you." He turned to Samah and said, "What has gotten into your abdal?" Wallaj's voice grew thin and nearly broke. "Here, now, in the courtyard. Ishara, she is taken." The king rose to his feet at this and cut him off. "My daughter? What about her now?" Elwain rose as well, but the others remained paralyzed in place. "All of you! Up, up!" Wallaj shouted, raising his arms over his head. When even this didn't rouse them, he rushed into the room, grabbed an engraved platter from the table, and hurled it to the ground. This clattering crash finally jolted the group, awakening them abruptly from a peaceful 500-year slumber. Samah pointed toward the arched door. Through it, at first, we saw only smoke. "They will burn the library," Elwain gasped. He rushed toward the balcony, ravens all at once taking flight about him, feathers tossed into the air in his wake. "This way!" he yelled as he ran through the door to the balcony beyond and looked down upon the doomed city in horror.
It was night on the first day of autumn. Gran was staring into the candle, brooding like the dim sky that lay outside her window. The Imari and Mibari were as estranged siblings, one always blessed by fate, the other equally cursed. Eventually that turns to resentment. No good could come of it. She ran a finger back and forth across the flame. "You're still too young to understand what followed, little owl." Ayta nodded, her mouth a stoic, soldierly line. "The Mibari killed them." Gran only smiled. But the younger Ayta shook her head. "I do too understand. My cat Dana was my only friend before you came. She died, but I still see her in my dreams sometimes." Dana, who had been her second shadow, was transformed in an instant into a thing like a bushel of hay. She had picked it up, gingerly at first, but found this object she held was no longer her companion. Stiff and strangely light. She didn't yet have the words for any of this. "Listen," Gran said, removing the finished mask from the altar and holding it out to Ayta, who reached up to grasp it in her tiny fingers. Though her face was still too small to fit, Ayta put it on, as Gran continued to speak. "Let your soul pass unnoticed, a scout in this world for those of us who dwell forever in that other one. We will see through your eyes." When Ayta had stood over Dana's body all those years before, her mother said that it was the spirit who was gone. Something was not there that had been before. But Ayta had felt otherwise, although she didn't say anything. All was as it had been before her little playmate first arrived. A hint of the true mystery. The dead do not leave, their enduring absence is only revealed. She remembered the pain so clearly, the tiny void that seemed to open in her life. But this was her pain, her void. Nothing had changed. Not really. The world was unmoved. In the end, that indignity is what had hurt most. And now, she could hardly remember her original furry friend. Dana was soon replaced by a stuffed animal, which Ayta's mother gave to placate her tears. The worst part is that it had worked. What Gran was saying followed a twisted but compelling logic. The hidden world is the real one. And what is a lifetime when viewed from eternity? "This you must understand about my tale," Gran said. "The seasons grow within us, my dear, in the inner world. But I would only find her once I climbed the world's spine. By now, you must know of whom I speak." A cat yowled somewhere in the night, and old Gran began to cough. "The next stage of your training begins tonight. I warn you, it always exacts a price." A beat-up taxi drifted by outside. Gran huddled in her blankets, just a shadow in a room in a sprawling city. The year was 1999, a number that meant nothing. It was a time that was alien to her, and she was an alien to it. She was small and frail, the city around her large and indifferent. That is all for Season 1. We will be taking a brief pause before continuing with Season 2, The Fall Tree. Stay up to date with upcoming episodes by subscribing at fallencycle.podbean.com or wherever you prefer to listen to your podcasts. Check out the work of the contributing musicians. Those links and additional information is available in the text provided along with this episode. This audio edition was produced by James Kershaw, along with text-to-speech synthesis. A statement on the use of LLMs is available on our website for those curious about how we do and don't use these technologies. This podcast is Creative Commons 3.0, attribution, share and share alike, non-commercial use.